Hi, Erin. How are you doing?
Hi, I'm doing well. How are you?
Great, 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 great. So we're gonna spend some time talking science and science fiction, and I had my wonderful time on your podcast, which was great, great fun, and so I thought we would exchange the favor.
Well,
So
thank you. I appreciate it.
yes, and now so give us a little bit background on how you became an astrophysicist. What's the what got you the bug?
Yeah, I think most people when they're growing up, love space and dinosaurs. Like those seem to be the things that just capture people's imaginations. And it certainly was the case for me. I loved going to science museums and I loved space and I loved dinosaurs and all that fun stuff.
Mhm.
But for me, it wasn't really, there were kind of two factors. One was Dana Scully. I was obsessed with the X-Files, was growing up right around, when that was going out. I was probably a little bit too young to watch it when I started watching, but I was obsessed with this redheaded woman who fought aliens with science. And that's all I wanted to be and do. And
Wow.
then I found out that um, her original degree was in physics, particularly astrophysics. And that was when I kind of looked that up and realized you could have an entire degree based on studying space. So that blew my mind. And from then on, that was just what I wanted to do. It wasn't necessarily that I had a career end goal in mind, but I knew going off to college and then continuing on from there, I wanted to study space while I figured out what else I would do with my life.
Yes, and were you a big science fiction geek from the get-go, or
Yeah, I wasn't really raised with a lot of science fiction. My parents weren't necessarily sci-fi fans, but like I said, I watched the X-Files and then I had family members who were invested in getting me into science fiction. And so that was, even just as simple and as universal as Star Wars, that was sort of, I was a little bit older when I got into it, but I was still a kid. And those ideas of just traveling through space really sparked my imagination, these stories set in space. And so I started reading a little bit more and started finding science fiction in that realm.
Mhm.
And but it wasn't really until college that I got into science fiction properly, where my fellow physics majors were like, okay, so here's the list of shows that you need to watch, and Star Trek is right on the top.
Yeah, 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 yeah. And it's and by the way, I should mention to the fans who are watching us that feel free to throw questions in about science and all of that, because all of us who are science fiction writers, there's always the question of how far down the rabbit hole do you want to go? How much do you want to talk about astrophysics and and all of that stuff. And of course there's a spectrum. There's the hard science fiction writers like Heinlein and all those guys, the ones who often come out of engineering and or astronomy. Arthur C. Clarke is sort of a little sort of mid-range, but a little leaning toward that. And then you have the people like Ray Bradbury who said, "Well, I know Mars isn't scientific, but who cares?"
Right,
So
right, exactly.
yeah, and
Yeah.
then when you move into TV and film, budget becomes a huge aspect of where you plant your flag as well. So I don't know if you now now
Yeah.
you've gotten one of the greatest gigs ever now, which is a science advisor on Star Trek. So tell us how you got that gig and what that's like.
Yeah. I'm so like Lucille Ball said, luck is hard work and knowing what's opportunity and what's not. And I feel like that's kind of where I've been able to find this niche. But while I wanted to pursue science, I also loved film and the entertainment industry. And so I took lots of films classes when I was in college and always had in the back of my mind I was also a dancer, and then I got into theater later just as hobbies. But this idea that you could be a science consultant kind of blew my mind.
Hmm.
But I didn't necessarily, there's no clear path of how to do that. For me, when I left academia, I was pretty lost. I didn't know that I wanted, I knew I didn't want to be a professor, but I found other opportunities. I started doing science communication at museums. I started teaching at community college as an adjunct professor. Loved, loved, loved teaching. Did not cover the bills, unfortunately. And so I went into engineering, went into the industry. But in order to kind of keep that teaching bug going, I started giving talks at science fiction conventions, talking about the science behind our favorite franchises or just general, faster than light travel or artificial gravity. And that's how I started to meet writers, actors, creators. And then I moved out to LA a couple years ago for
Mm.
myriad reasons. And through that, started to just kind of expand my network, and started giving talks at the official Star Trek conventions and events. And they, with the amount of content that they're adding, saw the value in having a scientist be available to all the writers and to help with that. I think the hardest thing, and I think a lot of scientists struggle when they try to go into this, is letting go. You mentioned that the science is hard in sci-fi and TV and movies, and it is the budget, but it's also time. When they've got to condense a script down to fit in a fixed time, technobabbles out the door. So
Yeah.
that's hard.
Well, it's interesting because I grew up when I was a kid. It was the great age of science fiction on TV and film, and also in aerospace. You had the Mercury through the Apollo programs, and so real space travel was inextricably entwined with science fiction. And now we're in a sort of a second age of manned exploration, and with Elon Musk and NASA joining forces and all of that, the two guys they just shot up in the
Right.
Dragon, really cool. And so it's interesting with Star Trek, particularly because Star Trek was really the first science fiction show that was talking to scientists in that way, with like the Rand Corporation, those guys. And it's funny that you mentioned Lucille Ball, because she, of course, as head of Desilu, was the executive who greenlit Star Trek into
Yep.
production. So
Big hero of mine. Big hero. Love
yeah,
her.
big time. But now it's very interesting with Star Trek, because now they've brought it back as multiple series: Picard and Discovery, and the coming Pike series, and the animated one, Below Decks. And so now you weren't aboard as science consultant on the first season or two of Discovery, is that correct?
That's correct.
Right.
Yeah. So nothing I've consulted on has aired yet, and I
Right.
am on the edge of my seat. So season 3 of Discovery was the first thing that I worked on.
Yes.
But yeah, a lot of things are in development now, so I'm all over the place.
Yeah.
You'll have my stamp on a lot of stuff.
But it's fascinating, because there's, when you're close to our time, like in something like The Expanse, you're dealing with orbital mechanics and all of that. Whereas by the time you get to Star Trek, with warp drive and all of that and artificial gravity, you're much more in a speculative place.
Yeah.
And
yeah, and I think that's, people always ask me too, like how as a scientist I enjoy science fiction, and it's much easier for me to enjoy the stuff that's set way in the future because I've switched off a lot of stuff. I'm like, all right, sure, we figured that out at some point. Whereas if it's set 10 years from now, I'll be a little bit more like, do we have that?
Right. And it's, well, with Space Command, it's interesting because Space Command starts 60 years from now and goes a further 100 and whatever years, and then we had a prequel that goes 30 years earlier. So it's like 30 years from now, then we jump 60 years from now, and so forth, and cover 180 years in total. But that was also deciding, we couldn't do zero G, obviously. The first one who really attempted that, of course, persuasively, was 2001: A Space Odyssey, which is just phenomenal. And but we do have, like, certain, we've talked with NASA, we've talked with JPL, we've talked with the flight surgeon at Houston, the Johnson Space Center, and the real space command, the Air Force One. So but there's always those questions about, okay, how do we do this, because obviously certain things we can't do. So so with Star Trek, you're less encumbered in that way, but it must be a dream job in that way, to be dealing with those scripts and those writers and that history of science fiction that goes back so many decades.
Yeah, I mean, it's a legacy, and that's kind of the thing that's taken me so long to just accept, to go, oh no, it's Star Trek. It's Star Trek. No, I'm completely honored, and it's a legacy of people who's especially, gone, like Andre Bermanis and Narain Shakar have gone on and just done amazing things, and they started as science consultants on Star Trek. So no pressure, right? But I'm really excited to kind of see what the future brings.
Yes. Well, now on that note, do you also want to be a writer as well, working in TV, or is that a goal that would be something you'd really enjoy?
Yeah, I've had people ask me for a long time if I had pop science books like Brian Greene or Neil deGrasse Tyson, and I've always struggled to write prose, like novel prose, fiction or nonfiction. But once I started working in the film writing community, I found screenwriting very, very natural to me. I don't know if it's just because I studied so much film or if that's just a medium that I immerse myself in a lot more. But I have definitely found a passion for that. And I've been lucky enough to be in a fire hose of training of being in 6 writers' rooms at once and learn how to work with different, showrunners and writing styles and then growing my experience with going beyond just doing line edits, but actually being able to contribute more to pitches and stories and all of that. I really love it. I love it. And it's definitely awoken it's fed that creative side. And that's the thing that I'm most excited about is I see something that I can do finally for the first time. I have a career that I love.
Great. That's great. Now, Adam, do we have any questions yet, or just chime in as we get questions from our audience? Okay.
Will do.
Great.
No serious questions yet.
Yes, just facetious ones.
Just someone's talking about a drinking game or something.
Yeah. Well, they need to get out more. Yeah.
Right. There are, if that's about the bowling ball on the trampoline, then you can have a drink. People who follow my stuff, I always end up having to explain space time with the bowling ball on the trampoline, and I say it so many times we've turned it into a drinking game. So if that's what you were looking for,
that's fun. So in terms of science fiction and extrapolating out from the current state of science, so are there things that you're finding particularly interesting in the scientific world that you think can be extrapolated in science fiction?
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the hardest thing to do when it comes to science fiction that is set so far in the future. There are a lot of rules gone, but there's also that unknowns, right? We don't know what kind of technology that we're going to have. So keeping an ear out for the stuff that's really cutting edge is really important. For me personally, I mean, I have a personal interest. I'm a little bit biased, but my PhD was in general relativity and particularly the search and discovery of gravitational waves.
Yes.
And I left the field a year before their Nobel Prize winning detection. I loosened the jarlet is my official story. But that's a whole new realm of astrophysics. It's like, the analogy is we've been looking at the universe for years and sound doesn't travel in space, but detecting gravitational waves now is almost like you're hearing for the first time. So being able to combine those two senses, as it were, is going to lead to a lot of new discoveries in our universe. I'm very excited.
Yeah.
I do have a question.
Sure.
This one's just from me. Dr. McDonald, do you concur with Neil deGrasse Tyson on his theory about the Gulf Stream and being able to lasso a comet? Which is from
that's some
Ripple
using
Effect.
Space Command. Neil deGrasse Tyson was at our gym a few years ago, and I said, if you were going to bring something back from space that could help with global warming, what would it be? And he thought for a few days and then told me this loopy idea, which was, and it was actually from a friend of his, which is to go out into space, lasso an ice comet, tether it to one of the poles, and get the Gulf Stream going again. So in Space Command, we actually do that. And
amazing.
Yeah, pretty hilarious. So in Ripple Effect, we actually have Neil deGrasse Tyson on camera talking. I mean, he actually played himself in this episode of Space Command, which was terrific. We'll have to give you a cameo at some point too, Erin. That'd be really fun.
Would be more than happy to. And I love that. I think that was also something similar along those lines was a joke in Futurama about dealing with climate change, was just take a giant ice cube and just dump it into the ocean.
And we referenced that in the episode as well. I think given your area of initial expertise, I think we might want to have an episode where you're a gravity wave surfer. So
I'll take it.
That'll be fun. That'll be very fun. And so walk us through like your given work day, work week. Like you go to the Enterprise and where's it go from there?
Right. It used to be, up until a few months ago, it was very different, because I think a lot of people in this town in LA can certainly relate to juggling lots of jobs at one time. But I was working as a technical advisor for what is now the Space Force. It used to be U.S. Space Command, and before that it was Air Force Space Command. So I was trying to juggle a lot of those, working just as a tech advisor and then also doing script editing. But these days, now, especially in the current kind of climate that we're in, I am reading scripts. I am sitting in room meetings doing just generic Q&As or trying to help break story. I am helping, friends will send me their scripts. So I've got sort of a few that, I'll go through and help and edit with. I do consulting otherwise as well. And then I also have kind of my own online content, the Dr. Erin Explains the Universe. So I stream on Twitch and I have a patron. And so it's a lot of fun kind of creativity. It does that, in terms of the busyness and responsibilities and not many days off, but it's fun. I love it.
That's great. That's really great. And again, the fact that that you're able to have such input and really be working with so many writers is really spectacular. And so, do you feel, what's your feeling about the Star Trek franchise in general? I mean, do you feel that it's durable and that it can have? I mean, it's there's been, of course, that there's been a very strongly polarized reaction to some of the more recent Star Trek movies and TV shows. So I don't know what your thought is about that, but please let us know.
I mean, I'll be the first to admit that I'm like a Pollyanna when it comes to a lot of this stuff, that I will go in and just be overly enthusiastic. You throw anything into my fictional world, I will eat it up. But I think that the Kelvin films that came out, 10 years ago were great at introducing Star Trek to a new generation of people. That it really was sort of like, oh, this is a franchise that I think I might like, that feels accessible to me now. And people have gone and then discovered it. And then with, Discovery and Picard coming back, you're always going to get that backlash. I mean, people have pulled out hate fan mail from when The Next Generation first aired of, this isn't real Star Trek and you don't understand. And then the same thing happened with Voyager and Deep Space Nine and all of that stuff. So it's just the cycle of Star Trek fans. And I think especially now, it's been great to go to Star Trek conventions year after year as Discovery's been airing and see that polarization is starting to disappear, that, people are getting to know the characters and the stories and get used to sort of the new format, these new ways of telling stories that we can do now, and really embrace it. And there are some, it's great characters, great storytelling. And what I'm most excited about is when these other shows, because Picard, is a great callback to The Next Generation. But now, as you mentioned, we're going to have an animated Lower Deck series. We're going to have an animated Nickelodeon series. We're going to have the Pike's show, and Discovery and Picard are still going on. So there's so much Star Trek content that I feel like that just tempers the criticism, because people will be able to find one that they like. Yes. And if you don't like any of them, there's 700 hours of Star Trek out there. You can find one for you. But certainly the in-person, the Star Trek fan community is a really, overall, I've found it to be a very welcoming place. And I'm very grateful for it.
Yeah, and it's really fun because fandom, you have all the way from the older guys who came up with the original show, the older fans, but also the actors who are still with us, Walter Koenig, Nichelle Nichols, who's in Space Command and so forth. And but then you have each generation has their own Star Trek show that they might love. And also the one difference between science fiction and other genres, or even mainstream fiction, is that you're creating not just a series of characters, but also a universe. And the universe has so many offshoots. I mean, Gene Roddenberry, I can't really think of another example prior to Gene where he created a huge hit show and then did a second version of that show with completely different characters, which I think was a stroke of genius. And that was a huge hit as well. I mean, that was, because they tried to bring back Gunsmoke years later or whatever, and those things always flopped, or they do a TV movie on Gilligan's Island or whatever, the way the Harlem Globetrotters show up. It's like, bad idea, guys. But Star Trek, he really proved that it wasn't the characters. You didn't need Kirk, Spock, McCoy to have a Star Trek thing work. And that was brilliant. And so I think, so if you were, let's say for a moment that you were the god of Star Trek, okay? So let's say you woke up tomorrow and you were the god of Star Trek and you could have the Star Trek franchise go anywhere, do anything. What would you want it to do? What would be your dream come true?
There's so much. The thing that I love and that I do think that we are going to be able to see is expanding the demographic of Star Trek fans, particularly for younger audiences. And that's what makes me so excited, like about the Nickelodeon animated show, which not much has been released other than there is a Nickelodeon animated show. But the fact that you can target a younger audience, because I think Star Trek has inspired so many, in terms of its legacies, generations after generations of people. And as if you were raised in a household that watched Star Trek, you saw it at a young age, but like me, I didn't.
Huh.
But you were still able to be influenced by it to want to become a scientist at some point. It still has played such a role in our society. And so the ability to have that Star Trek universe more accessible to younger kids, I think is only going to expand that ability to inspire more kids to get into science and,
Yeah.
and just to that creative spark. Like I said, people love space. And so to have these fictional stories where they can see themselves in a character flying around the stars, whether that inspires them to become a scientist or just makes them feel like they belong somewhere, that's incredibly powerful. That's what so they're kind of doing it. I'm just a sucker for animation in general, so I'm always happy. But it's going to be great to see some kid oriented ones, some more humor oriented. There's going to be Star Trek for everyone, and that's what makes me really happy.
That's really fun. Now
we've got a new question in from Droid Girl, who asks, of the shows that you've worked on, what are some of these sci-fi concepts that you've seen that are the closest predictions to actual science?
Well, we can start with you on that, Erin, and then I can jump in.
Yeah, I mean, well, a lot of the ones that I've worked on haven't aired yet. So in terms of narrowing it to that, we're not quite there to be able to talk about that level of specifics. But I think that Star Trek in general, though, has led us towards some technology. It's like, now we're at the stage where we're like, remember flip phones, man?
Yeah.
And those were, the communicators in the 60s and things like data pads and, the original Kindles, I will say these original e-readers are suspiciously shaped exactly like the pads from TNG. It's beyond a coincidence there.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts, Mark, on that.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I've worked on, having worked on Next Gen and DS9 and Babylon 5 and Sliders and on and on and on, and now Space Command. And then also, writing about the Twilight Zone, the fascinating thing, well, one thing that's funny about Twilight Zone is Rod Serling's lack of knowledge of science. I mean, he has, asteroids with air, oxygen atmospheres and talks about millions of miles to the nearest star system and all this nonsense. And so he was essentially, I would say, scientifically illiterate practically. But then you get to Star Trek, and the thing about the original Star Trek, and that was great, was they just throw you in the deep end of the pool. When you see that first pilot, they're not explaining warp engines or transporters or communicators. They're just using them like we would use a car and a telephone and so forth. And so when I got to writing for Next Gen or DS9 or any of these things, having grown up in the genre, it was all just second nature. And the question with any given show is, okay, what's the technology or what's the pseudo technology, and what's the justification for whatever that technology or pseudo technology is? And but I was, of course, so steeped in the technological subgenres of science fiction, both written and dramatized, so that in certain shows you'd have slower than light travel stories like the Heinlein stuff, where you're dealing with all of that 1G acceleration and so forth. And then, of course, because science fiction writers wanted to write about other star systems and alien life and so forth, then they had to figure out, okay, what would a faster than light drive be like, and come up with all sorts of justifications for that. And that gets very much into theoretical stuff. But like when I was doing Sliders, when I was producing that show, again, that there is no parallel universe machine. Much as we might want to journey to the universe that doesn't have Trump in it, but though I won't talk about politics. But but so I was in contact with the guys at Star Trek, saying, do you guys have any pseudo technological stuff on parallel universes, just to see what we could bandy about. And now here we are, 50 years later from the initial moon landing, and we're and as I said to you when we had that conversation on your podcast, the one thing science fiction never predicted was we would go to the moon and stop.
Yeah.
And so I'm very glad that at long last we have people seriously talking about sending people to Mars. You know, I think that's either going to be Elon Musk or the Chinese. I don't think NASA's on its own recognizance could ever get there, because they're always at the whim of the political moment. And, you know, so, but in terms of the shows I've worked on, Space Command has been the most interesting in terms of working out a pseudo technology, or extrapolating from the current technology, because I'm very consciously dealing with slower than light fusion drive, and then you find an alien ship that's got a faster than light drive, but you can't replicate that because it goes away. And so then you work up an experimental drive, which I call the Gernsback drive, which is named after Hugo Gernsback, who founded Amazing Stories, and the Hugo Award is named after. And so we have the M, you know, the Gernsback drive that takes us into M space, which is basically, you know, because the whole gag, of course, is that within space you theoretically can't go faster than the speed of light. So if you go outside of space time, then the rules might be very different. And you know, and so I've been working with that, so, and dealing with the whole notion of alien technologies, because I believe that life is extremely ubiquitous throughout the universe. And the moment we go anywhere, I think, you know, Mars or the outer moons, we're going to find life. But
my money's on Europa. I think that we'll dig under Europa. It probably won't be some giant octopod alien monster like some movies show, but I think at the very least we're going to see some sort of like bacteria or something like that. And I'm really, I'm sure we will, because it's a warm saltwater ocean.
That's actually a good segue into our next question from Les Grossman, who asks, in light of the epidemic, how do you advise planet party landing scenes that show zero protocols, protection, and precautions? And how are realistic premises important to you?
Yes, and by the way, Les, I want to compliment you for your handle. I'm a big fan of Tropic Thunder, and that's a great character. So yeah, so why don't you start, Erin, and talk about Star Trek and how they're handling this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky, right? Because we are certainly in a moment now that I think is going to go down. It will go down in history. And I think that how much it's going to change our everyday lives still remains to be seen. Like what that new normal is going to look like, we can't see on the other side of this. I was reminded of that recently because trying to escape all of it, watching Star Trek, and we were watching the Enterprise for my my patron episode where we break down science for it, and they walk out and introduce themselves to an alien species and hold their hand out, and they're waiting. And the aliens are kind of like, what? He's like, this is what we do. We shake hands when we greet people. And I was like, no, that's not what we do anymore.
Right.
And so, you know, little nuances like that we know our world is changing, but it's changing so quickly that I think just being aware of things, you know. And the other thing too is I know a lot of people are still getting used to, but saying, you know, like manned missions versus crewed missions, and trying to change our vernacular to say crewed is still, it's because we're so used to saying it. And so those little nuances that we try to work in and try to catch, because our society's changing such that, like, you know, that it has lasting power, that if you watch it in 20 years, you're not like, whoa, no, we don't do that anymore. So it's really interesting. And especially for a show that like Star Trek, that has such the legacy that you can go back and watch quite a lot of it without it feeling dated. That's hard to do. And it's paying attention to those things.
Yeah, though I remember Jay Leno, before he was famous for the Tonight Show, I once saw him do a stand-up, and he talked about the original Star Trek and how every week they seemed to go to Planet of the Hookers, you know, because the costumes, you know. So so there is that. So
there's Mudd's Women has not aged well. So there are quite a few original series.
Yeah, but still we love all of that. But in terms of the pandemic, it's fascinating because it's both dealing with story elements, and that's very interesting to see how science fiction dealt with pandemics and zombie plagues and all of those things, as opposed to what's happening now, which is very instructive and interesting to compare and contrast. But then the other thing is, now as we get back into production, there are those interesting questions of how are we going to do that now with Ripple Effect. You know, the 2 hours episode we debuted today, that was deliberately, for me, a 5-finger exercise to see what we could do without having a crew go from hither to yon and have 100 people on a set, but have our actors shoot their own scenes and use the tricks of visual effects to put characters together in a scene where they physically were actually not even in the same country, or or use footage and match the lips so they could have new lines like Doug Jones in the scene with Bob Picardo. So there were a lot of tricks that one had to do, and now as we start to very gingerly get back into more active production again, it's like we're starting to say, well, what if we shoot with just 1 or 2 actors at most, and we enjoy safety protocols? And so it's going to be a long time. Like there's a scene in the new Space Command episode we were about to shoot before the pandemic where you've got like 30 extras. Well, I think it's going to be a long time before we have 30 actors on the set. I think that we may do, VFX, where we create a synthetic people that way, CG people, but we're not going to be having crowd scenes in anytime soon, I don't think.
Yeah. So if people want more sci-fi content, stay home and wear your masks.
Yes.
Because we got to start filming soon. Please. Yeah. There is a finite amount of content out there. You will run out.
Yes. Yes.
We need to keep making more.
Yeah.
So getting to Space Command, I have a question from where is that? I'm sorry. Oh, here it is. Aliens in the Attic, who asks, if you were in Space Command, what crew member position would you like to be? For Erin, Dr. Erin.
Awesome.
Would you pilot, captain, science officer?
My default, my go-to is always science officer, because I was like, I can do that job. But then I do really like being in charge. I like leading a group of people. I'm a big picture person.
Yeah.
And I feel like my career path would mirror Captain Janeway's, the science officer turned captain, hopefully not lost on the other side of the galaxy, but and in Space Command too. And that's the interesting thing, is when science fiction for years has modeled itself on military structure, even though they're not necessarily military characters. And so you see those same positions, whether it's Star Trek or Space Command or those, you can see that position and go, science officer, that's my job.
Yeah, that's fun. And but though actually it sounds from your predilections, it sounds like showrunner is a really good job to aim for as well.
Right. Yeah, there you go.
Exactly. And but it's interesting too, because when Michael Reeves and I worked up the Captain Sulu series, after we did World Enough in Time, we had a Klingon science officer on Sulu's ship, and that was very interesting, with the idea that the Klingons, we'd only really seen the warrior cast, and there was another cast that was sort of the science cast that was very different temperamentally. And that was a lot of fun to play with that notion of a Klingon science officer on a Federation ship. And so there's, now it's also interesting though, the when you're working up a story and the science, if it's a battle between characterization or a really strong story and science has to take a back seat if there's a great story and or great characters. So that also, there always is that balancing act where you don't want to do anything incredibly egregious.
Yes. Yeah. And that 9 times out of 10, that's what my job ends up doing, is just saying, all right, we can come up with this cool idea. If that's what you want to do, we can help. And if it gets so outrageous that the story is great, that the story's still great, we're better off not explaining the science.
Yes.
And we'll just take a step back and, just like you said, not say anything egregious. Make sure it's just not wrong.
Right. Right. Unobtainium. But but yes, and but now also another subject that we haven't really gotten deep into, and is the whole notion of intelligent alien life. And for instance, in Space Command, very deliberately, my idea is that the alien life we encounter will not be humanoid at all, that it will be extremely different, because my personal belief is that when we do, if and when we do encounter a sentient species, the likelihood is very strong that they will be very, very, very different from us. Yeah. And so I don't know if you'd like to comment on your thoughts about that, but please.
Yeah, it's one of the most fun activities that I've done when I've gone to sci-fi conventions. If they have a kid education focus, one of the exercises I like doing is talking to kids about how planets can influence species. And so they get to design either an alien species or a superhero based on a planet that they choose. Yes. And it's because it's just, we've said infinite diversity and infinite combinations, it's, there's gonna be aliens, and it's the unknown. And when we're searching for sentient alien life, we can only reference what we know.
Yes.
We can only know to look for the stuff that we know. And so figuring out what these communication methods might be. Now, there is still that universal physics, right? However, another sentient species will have interpreted light, it's still light.
Yes.
And they might call it, treat it, use it slightly differently, but there are still going to be these physics fundamentals that we can start to figure out. And so when it comes to sentient life, and not sentient life in the sense that they're technologically advanced,
Yes.
then that's going to be really interesting. But that's very hard to reach that point.
Yes.
Space is dark and scary and throws lots of bad things at us. So,
yeah. Well, it's so interesting, that question of how many sentient species there might be, and what is a sentient species, as you say,
right.
a technological sentient species, because again, we're only working with an example of one at this stage. And when you talk about the Drake equation, which postulates how many civilizations there might be out there, it's very interesting, because one thing that we have no idea of is how long a technological society lasts.
Yeah.
Because we have such destructiveness, self-destructiveness built into our into us as an animal. And so, we've only really been a technological society for a little over 100 years in the way that a sentient species might even be able to detect us.
Yeah.
Except for the oxygen atmosphere, which at least says it's a specific kind of life here.
Right.
But it is very interesting to speculate on. The other question, which I find very interesting, is once we encounter, if we encounter other technological species, what kind of animal becomes a technological civilization? Is it necessarily a predatory one? It's an interesting question, because there was someone, I can't remember who it was. Well, that was very funny. When they put the plaque up on the moon for the moon landing, they asked a number of writers what they thought should be on that plaque for alien species that might come to it. And there was a writer named I.F. Stone, and what he said should be on that plaque was "run."
I mean, it's not wrong.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, but people always ask too, because we're kind of touching a little bit on the Fermi paradox, that if there's so much life out there, why hasn't anyone reached out to us? That we might not be at a part where we could, but why hasn't anyone else? And there's lots of answers ranging from philosophical to technological, of just saying, do you try to teach bugs English? Like if you're that advanced, maybe you're not bothered with us. Or like you said, both our own self-destructive tendencies, but also space has world-ending events that happen quite frequently. Things like gamma ray bursts and, solar events that could be very destructive, and just asteroids themselves can take out entire civilizations. So space is scary.
Yeah. And speaking of solar events like that, or asteroids hitting the Earth and all of that, so what is your thought about Elon Musk's idea of putting 1 million people on Mars, so to give us sort of a spare tire?
Yeah. There's a lot of back and forth in this. I love the ambition.
Yeah.
I love that the dialogue is happening, that people are starting to take it seriously. I am concerned about it being like, when you have one person who has the ability to launch, to build technology, to build all of that. We have that discussion with the Starlink satellites and that effect on astronomy here at home, both, casual hobbyists as well as professionals. But we can't stop it. There's no way to stop it. But I think, Mars is very difficult. And one book I love recommending to people is called Packing for Mars by Mary Roach. And she goes down all of the ways that space is hard. For me personally, I think in terms of like terraforming biodomes, all of that, we can figure that out. We can live underground. We can, we can do all that. The radiation, I think we still have to figure out. You're exposed to a lot of radiation once you leave our magnetic field.
Yes.
And Mars is bombarded with it because it doesn't have a magnetic field. That's why it doesn't have a strong enough atmosphere. It has 0.6% what we have, so hardly anything. There's hardly any protection from radiation. And so that's something that we're really going to have to figure out. And I haven't really seen much on that sense yet. But all of that being said, like I said, I'm a Pollyanna when it comes to like my franchises, less so when it comes to the practicality of space travel. But I love the dialogue. I want people to be excited about it. I want people to think that this is attainable, that it might happen in our lifetime to send humans up there. Even just to set foot on Mars, I think would be that we just got to do that first.
Yes. It's so amazing because, well, like for instance, because extrapolating out from the present day with Space Command, it's like my idea was, well, put people in caves, find the caves, seal those off, fill them with atmosphere. It's that makes sense because then you are shielded. And then as we go out to the outer moons, places like Titan, which has atmospheric pressure, but not a breathable atmosphere,
right.
And it's really cold. But again, you start to look at, okay, how would one survive? Or even when we were talking about Europa with that water ocean under several miles of ice, you start to think about, okay, it would be like living underwater. Could people do that? Potentially, but it's a long way out to that, to the outer planets, and then if you talk about a manned mission to another system, that's a whole nother category entirely.
Yeah. And people always ask too, this idea of, is it worth it? Like, why would we spend all the money to go out there? And for me, just as we're discussing, it's the challenge. It's the technological challenge, the ability to think outside the box, to go, okay, like we're screwing up our planet pretty good.
Yes.
We have it easy here and we're still managing to screw it up. But the challenge of going to somewhere like Mars and just saying, okay, how would we do that? And start pushing that envelope.
Yes.
And the amount of technological advances that could happen from that challenge that could have a positive benefit here on Earth. This is why I will always advocate for space exploration and space travel, just because it's hard and that makes us mighty. And I love that.
And I also like the fact that, man is such a strange and interesting animal because we have such an enormous capability for destruction that it's built into us. We are an extremely violent creature. And yet we also have this amazing ability to look up at the stars and say, what are those? And find out. And so when we reach for the stars, when we go to Mars and the moon and all of these places we've gone with our robots and our people, it's the best of us. And amazingly, we haven't fought a war in space. And Trump is doing his damnedest to screw that up, but so far space has not been militarized in that way. And I think part of it is because it's such an incredibly dangerous environment that people have to collaborate because there's not much room to fuck up. It's I was thinking recently about space and what on Earth might be somewhat analogous, and even the Arctic and Antarctic aren't analogous because you can breathe that air. The closest analogy is the deeper parts of the ocean, because you cannot open a door, you cannot step outside. It is death, and that's what space is inevitably. Or Mars, again, you're not going to crack open your visor and just take a deep breath of that Martian atmosphere.
It's okay. I've been to Detroit, sir.
Right, really, exactly. Yes.
I do have two more questions.
Great.
This next one is from, gosh, what was the name? I think it was, nope, I lost it. But they ask for Dr. McDonald, compared to real science, what are some of the weirdest concepts that you've seen, the weirdest sci-fi concepts that you've seen?
I love me some time travel and multiverse theories, especially when you try to explain time travel in a closed system.
Oh yeah,
that's hard. That's hard. And trying, and you can actually make time travel close to being scientific if you can try to get all those paradoxes fixed. And that's
the problem.
Hard to do. It's really entropy is what screws it up, because things age over time, and once you break that, you've broken physics.
Yeah. And so time travel, I've written time travel very little because again, because of the paradoxes, whereas parallel Earths is great fun. And I remember I wrote an episode of Sliders where I had, in our dimension, quote unquote, our hero built a machine to a slide to parallel dimensions. So I created a parallel Earth where the duplicate of Quinn invented a machine that rather than doing that, it just unbeknownst to him, it sent the entire population of the Earth, except for him, to a parallel Earth. So his Earth was instantly depopulated, and the other Earth doubled its population instantly with all these duplicates. And for years, he thought that he was the last man on Earth, that he vaporized everyone. And then our guys show up and say, no, you just sent them somewhere. Let's go there and see what happened. And then the question is, do we slide that population back because people have formed marriages and have children and so forth, and how to make that decision? And it was great fun to play with that speculation. So I loved all of that stuff. And Adam, you said there was another question?
Yes, I got one more question from Wayne Goodman, who asks, and funnily enough, it's about time travel. Do you believe time travel might be possible? And if so, why haven't time travelers shown up in the past?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I kind of touched on why it's not possible. There's kind of two explanations. One is, when you look at our universe, it's 4-dimensional. 3 dimensions are time, or 3 dimensions are space that we can move around in. 1 dimension is time that we have no control in. And when you look at it mathematically that way, like we have, in describing our own universe, locked us out of time travel. But the big physics law that this breaks is entropy. It's the idea that, if you remember, if I'm throwing out a word that's bringing flashbacks of like chemistry 101 or something, then I apologize. But it's just that increased disorder. If you leave your room alone, if you don't clean your room for months, it's going to get messier. At some point, it's not just going to fix itself. And time travel is breaking that. It's basically saying it loses all of our understanding of causality. That's the space-time stuff, how causality works. And then entropy, how things age and become increasingly disordered over time. We can't do that, but we can still play with it. And I'm so sorry I can't credit it, but I saw the funniest thing on Twitter where someone said, like, maybe the phrase hindsight is 2020 was a time traveler trying to send us a message. And it's just, life feels a little surreal now that we're wondering if a time traveler is screwing up all their fixes they're trying to make right now. So,
But it's interesting because that's one of the subgenres of science fiction where you can point to H.G. Wells and say, he's the one who first wrote about a machine that would travel through time. Prior to that, it was like people getting hit on the head, like in Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court. So
right.
Yeah. And by the way, when Adam was saying, addressing you as doctor, I thought I should share with you, what doctorate I would want. Because there's such hard work. The one I would love to get is an honorary one. So
you just get out of writing that dissertation. High recommend.
Exactly. That's like being a colonel in the South. It's like Colonel Zickery. So glad to see you. These honorary titles. But we only have a few more minutes, Erin. But this has been such a great conversation. So, is there anything else you'd like to talk about? For instance, here's one. A lot of writers, even science fiction writers, are scientific lunkheads. And particularly in these political times where you have people who are actively, aggressively morons. So I don't know if you want to address that or speak to that at all, but please, you have the floor.
Yeah, I've been having a hard time these last couple months because I knew people didn't have a lot of respect for scientists, and I didn't realize how little respect people have for scientists. So it's been a little bit difficult. But I think, as a scientist, especially one who engages with the public, science communication is so important, and we so undervalue it when people get degrees in science because we do so much hard work to think critically, to understand our universe, to really problem solve properly. And then we're given no education on how to communicate that to people. That's the hard part. And so as a science communicator, I always say the most important thing is to genuinely don't make people feel dumb. Because if you get approached with a question, when I used to go out, I'd meet people and they were like, oh, you're an astrophysicist. Okay, so I saw this article about black holes and I just have to ask, like, since you're here, I get that all the time. And if I dismissed them or made them feel dumb, they would not just, you know, not want to ask a question again, but they would actively feel like science is against them and it's not accessible to them. And so that's why it's so important to kind of keep those lines of dialogue open and to be accessible and not make people feel dumb. But that's like the only thing I can do. And I got to be honest, I'm losing a lot. I'm struggling. I'm really losing a lot of hope in people because it's just like, exponential curves are a thing. They're not just going to turn around. Please.
Exactly. And one thing I wanted to mention before we go to our separate destinies is I'm very, I mean, as you know, I write and direct and produce with Elaine. There she is. Elaine.
Hi, Elaine.
Elaine. There she is. There she is. And so I've always been very strongly in favor of women in positions of power in television. And so I'm so glad, first of all, that you have the job you've got. And I think you are going to do very well in television. I think I will not at all be surprised when you become a showrunner and remember your friends. So
Well, we have to check the minutes because
how we work.
Well, do you have any questions, Elaine? Why don't you take a moment? No, you're talk about science. You've
and remember the voice of the person that asked questions from the audience too.
Yes, and definitely you can ask questions. But remember, you come from that era where they used to dissect frogs. And remember that great story of that girl in your class. If you want to share that, and I'll be right back. You can take the floor.
No. My story was we were dissecting things in high school, and we were dissecting and pinning a worm.
I remember doing those. Yeah.
And so we had partners, and so I looked down at this worm. And I said to this girl who was seated beside me randomly, because we were partners, I said, would you like to pin it or draw it? Which do you want to do? Would you rather pin it or draw it? And she said, no, I can't look at it. I can't look at it. Neither, you have to do both. And I said, no, we're dividing this up. You have to do one or the other, pin it or draw it. And she said, no. I said, but you have to. And she said, no, I don't. I'm a girl.
Ooh.
No.
No.
Yep.
And so I cut it, pinned it, and drew it. But yes, scientifically, that was extremely odd.
Yeah, no kidding. And it's so hard. I meet so many people who just say, you know, I love science but I'm just not good at it. And the next question I just ask is, you know, without being flippant, but which teacher was it? There's always a teacher that made you feel that you couldn't do science, and it's hard to teach, but yeah, it's a shame. There's been lots of people who would have made great scientists who were put off of it at a young age.
Yes.
It's difficult.
And I'm so glad that we had Nichelle Nichols playing Uhura, because a lot of women went into the sciences thanks to that model. And then as you said, Janeway, and of course all the strong women characters in Star Trek. Well, this has been great, Erin. I've really appreciated it. We'll definitely be talking a lot further in the near future, and at some point, I'm sure we'll grab a bite together when we won't be living under these interesting strictures. So,
sounds good. Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and congratulations on today. I wasn't able to catch the whole premiere, but I caught some of it. It's really good. So congratulations. Keep up the awesome work, and we'll cross paths again soon.
Thanks, Erin. Take care.
Bye.
Talk soon. Bye.